The forest did not simply sit at the base of Mount Fuji, it brooded there, heavy and unwelcoming, as though it had grown from sorrow itself. Its endless canopy of dark, gnarled trees stretched outward like a great sea of shadows, swallowing the mountain's light. Even from a distance, Aokigahara seemed different from any ordinary forest. Travelers described the silence as suffocating, as if the air itself resisted intrusion. Birds refused to sing here. Wind dared not pass through its branches. It was not merely a place, it was a presence. Kenji stood at its edge, the gravel path beneath his feet, marking the fragile boundary between the world he knew and the one that waited. His heart pounded with a rhythm that felt borrowed, like the forest itself was dictating his pulse. He had not come here for adventure, nor for curiosity, but because the weight of despair had hollowed him out. The whispers of the city had reached his ears, stories of the sea of trees, the infamous forest where countless had entered, leaving only silence in their wake. Some said their souls lingered among the twisted roots, condemned to repeat their final moments. Others claimed the forest consumed pain like an offering, pulling in the lost and broken. The late afternoon sun should have warmed his skin, but standing there, Kenji felt only a damp chill clinging to his body. Signs hammered into wooden posts lined the entrance, their words pleading with trembling hands. Think of your family. Your life is a precious gift. Turn back. The ink had faded, but the desperation in the message was still raw. He stared at them, and for a moment, his resolve faltered. But then it came, the whisper, faint and low, drifting from the trees like a secret carried by breath. His name, Kenji. He froze. Logic told him it was imagination, the echo of his own thoughts. Yet the sound was intimate, familiar, as though spoken by someone who knew him deeply. The forest beckoned, not with force, but with promise. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. His shoes crunched against the gravel as he stepped forward, and the world behind him seemed to dissolve. The light dimmed almost instantly, as though the trees had swallowed the sky whole. With every step, the air grew heavier, pressing down on his shoulders. Shadows shifted unnaturally, curling along the edges of his vision. Kenji swallowed hard, his throat dry, his chest tight. He realized he was no longer walking into a place, but into a story, one written long before he arrived. And the forest, silent and merciless, was waiting to make him part of it. The path that cut into Aokigahara was narrow, winding like a scar through the dense thicket. Kenji's feet pressed into the damp earth, each step sinking slightly, as though the forest resisted his presence. The canopy above closed in quickly, sealing away what little sunlight dared to follow him. Within minutes, the warmth of the outside world was gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness that clung to his skin like a wet shroud. His phone lost its signal almost immediately. The comforting glow of bars vanished, leaving only a black void where his connection to the world had been. The realization hit him like a blow. He was utterly cut off. No one to call, no one to hear him if he screamed. He was alone. The silence pressed into his ears until the sound of his own breathing became unbearable, echoing louder than it should have in the oppressive quiet. Signs nailed to trees appeared sporadically along the trail, written in sharp, desperate strokes. Life is worth living. Please, reconsider. Think of your loved ones. Some were splintered, others nearly swallowed by moss and rot, but each one stood as a monument to grief and loss. They were not ordinary warnings, they were confessions, written for the countless souls who had already surrendered here. Kenji slowed to read them, and the weight of their pleas pulled at his chest. For a moment, he felt the faintest urge to turn back, to run until the forest released him. But then it came again, that sound, a whisper. At first, it seemed to bleed from the trees themselves, soft as breath, brushing past his ear in tones that were neither male nor female. The word was clear, undeniable. Kenji. He spun around, heart thundering in his chest, but the path behind him was empty, swallowed in shadows. The trees stood still, ancient and indifferent, yet the voice lingered in his mind, an echo that did not belong to him. His skin prickled, his body warning him to flee, yet his legs carried him forward. The forest felt alive, every root and branch woven with secrets. The deeper he walked, the more distorted his sense of time became. Minutes stretched endlessly, each second thick and suffocating. The trail forked and twisted, every turn mirroring the last, until it seemed impossible to remember the way back. Kenji's throat tightened. He whispered to himself just to hear a human sound, but even his own voice sounded strange, too loud, too foreign, as if it did not belong to him anymore. He quickened his pace, though he didn't know why. Somewhere, in the heavy silence, he thought he heard footsteps that were not his own, faint but deliberate, following just beyond sight. With every step deeper into the forest seemed to close around him, pulling him into its heart like prey into a predator's embrace. And though he had only just begun, Kenji already sensed that the path ahead was not leading him somewhere, it was leading him downward, into something far older, darker, and merciless. The deeper Kenji ventured, the heavier the air became, as though the forest itself had drawn in a long breath and refused to release it. The silence was no longer simply quiet, it was predatory, coiled tight, waiting. His footsteps crunched faintly against the carpet of damp leaves and twisted roots. But even that sound seemed muted, swallowed almost instantly by the towering walls of trees. It was then, in that suffocating stillness, that the first whisper returned. At first, it was faint, so faint that he could almost convince himself it was the groan of wood shifting above. But then it came again, clearer, sharper, sliding along the edges of his hearing like a secret spoken into his skull. Kenji. The voice was low, deliberate, and carried with it an unnatural intimacy, as though whoever spoke it stood inches from his ear. His body froze, his lungs refused to expand, his chest locked in terror. Slowly, he turned, expecting to see anyone behind him, but the path was barren. The trees stretched endlessly, their trunks gnarled like twisted limbs. Their shadows fell across one another in strange shapes, twisting into faces that seemed to leer at him before dissolving back into bark. He shook his head, trying to clear the dread, but the whispers grew bolder. They weren't just calling his name now, they murmured in broken fragments, hushed syllables in languages he could not understand. Some sounded like cries, others like laughter, yet all of them seemed to converge on him, surrounding him, tightening their grip with every breath he took. Kenji pressed his hands to his ears, desperate to block them out. But the whispers only grew louder inside his skull, bypassing his body entirely. His knees trembled, his rational mind clawed for explanations, echo stress, hallucinations, but none of them explained why the voices knew his name. None explained why they carried the tone of the people he had once loved, lost, and left behind. For a moment, he swore he heard his mother's voice, pleading before it slipped into a guttural growl that curdled his blood. He staggered forward, stumbling over roots, driven not by will, but by a frantic need to escape. Yet the deeper he went, the more the whispers multiplied, threading together into a cacophony of phantom tongues. They did not shout, they did not scream, they hissed, they wept, they pleaded, until the forest no longer felt like trees and soil, but a living grave of voices, each one clawing at him, begging him to stay. Kenji's eyes darted wildly, his breath sharp and ragged. He began to notice objects scattered among the undergrowth, a shoe, a crumpled letter soaked by years of rain, a rusted canteen. Each relic felt like a fragment of someone else's last story. And with every discovery, the whispers seemed to surge in triumph. They were not random, they were not meaningless. They were the echoes of those who had stood where he stood, who had heard what he now heard, and who had never found their way out. And as Kenji pressed forward, trembling and drenched in cold sweat, he realized with horror that the voices no longer sounded distant. They were moving closer. Some whispered from behind him, some just ahead, and some unbearably right beside him, brushing against his skin with breath that should not exist. The forest was no longer simply watching him. It was speaking to him, and it would not let him go. Kenji's pace slowed when something unnatural broke the rhythm of trees and roots ahead. It hung from a low branch, swaying gently though there was no wind to move it. A rope thick, frayed, discolored by age and damp air. Its fibers were mottled with green mold, strands unraveling as though it had borne a terrible weight for too long. The sight froze him in place. He did not need to imagine what it had once supported. The truth was self-evident, carved into the silence around it. His throat tightened, bile rising, unbidden. The rope was a silent testimony, a remnant of someone's final moment. Yet what disturbed him more than the rope itself was the shadow beneath it. It was not the shadow of the branch, nor the rope, nor his own trembling figure. It was something darker and unnatural, blot on the ground that seemed to breathe. Its edges rippled faintly, refusing to obey the logic of light. When he shifted his head, the shadow shifted too, as though aware of his gaze. Kenji's body screamed to move, to run, but his legs betrayed him, locking in place. His eyes, wide and burning with tears he hadn't realized were forming, refused to look away. The forest around him seemed to lean inward, amplifying the silence until the pounding of his heart thundered in his ears. And then it came again, the whisper, this time closer, sharper, slicing through the thick air like glass against flesh. Stay. The sound did not echo. It burrowed. It seeped straight into his bones, making his muscles twitch and his skin crawl. Kenji spun around, desperate to catch the speaker, but the trail was empty, endless rows of crooked trees stretching into the dark. When he turned back, the shadows seemed larger, thicker, almost pulsing like a heart. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on a root. He nearly fell but caught himself, breath ragged, vision swimming. In that instant, he noticed something else. At the base of the rope lay an object half buried in leaves. With trembling fingers, he brushed the dirt aside. It was a wallet, weathered and cracked, its contents ruined by moisture. But one piece remained intact, a photograph. The image was blurred, but the faint outline of a smiling face stared back at him, frozen forever in an expression of warmth. The contrast between the photograph's life and the rope's silent truth was unbearable. He dropped it as though it had burned his skin. A movement caught his eye. The shadow quivered violently, then stretched outward like ink bleeding across paper. It reached for him, tendrils crawling toward his feet with deliberate intent. Kenji stumbled back again, his chest tight with panic. The rope swayed harder, though still no wind stirred. For a moment, he swore he saw something at the end of it, not a noose, but a faint shimmer, the outline of legs dangling, twitching, disappearing before his eyes could fully register it. He choked on a gasp, his breath hitching into sobs he tried to silence. The forest was no longer just whispering. It was showing him memories, fragments, imprints of suffering. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as though it might open and swallow him whole. He staggered away, eyes locked on the rope, until the trees finally swallowed it from view. Yet even after it disappeared, the image remained etched in his mind, and the shadow seemed to cling to his vision, as though it had followed him. Unseen but attached, Kenji quickened his pace, each step more frantic than the last. But deep down, he already knew the rope was not a warning. It was an invitation, and something in the forest had noticed him. Kenji pressed on, his feet stumbling over roots that seemed to twist deliberately in his path. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and dread. Every part of him screamed to leave the forest, but the way back had dissolved into sameness. Every tree, every turn, a cruel mirror of the last. The forest was not merely disorienting him, it was consuming his sense of direction, replacing the map in his mind with a labyrinth of despair. Then it happened again. At first, it was only a whisper, a murmur so faint he thought it might be the remnants of his own thoughts, echoing in the hollow silence. But then the sound grew sharper, closer. It wasn't drifting from the distance anymore. It was behind him. Stay with us. The words slithered against the nape of his neck, breath so real that his skin prickled with cold sweat. He froze. For a heartbeat he dared not move. His chest tightened painfully as he fought to hold back the urge to scream. Slowly, agonizingly slow, he turned his head. No one was there. The path behind him was empty, just rows of crooked trunks standing silently, their bark scarred and blackened. But the stillness carried weight, a suffocating heaviness that told him the voice hadn't been an illusion. Something had spoken to him, something that had been close enough to touch. Kenji's knees weakened, his eyes darted frantically across the ground, and that was when he noticed them. Objects scattered among the roots, half buried in damp soil. An old shoe, its leather rotting, a folded piece of paper, edges smeared with rain and time. He bent down with trembling fingers and lifted it. It was a note, the handwriting jagged, smudged but still legible. The words read like a desperate plea. "Forgive me, I can't carry it anymore." His stomach twisted violently. He dropped the paper, backing away. But as he did, more relics appeared, faded photographs nailed to trunks, letters wedged between roots, belongings left like fragments of broken lives. Each item radiated despair, heavy with unspoken stories. They weren't random litter, they were markers, tokens of people who had stepped into this forest and never stepped out. The whispers surged again, emboldened by his discovery. They circled him like vultures, voices overlapping in a suffocating chorus. Some begged softly, others laughed in cruel tones, and a few growled in guttural fragments that didn't sound human at all. He spun in circles, searching for bodies, for mouths, for anyone, but the trees only stared back, mute and unyielding. Then he felt a pressure, subtle at first, then undeniable. It pressed against his back, as though someone stood inches behind him, their presence heavy, their gaze boring into his skull. He dared not turn. He knew if he looked, he would see something he could never unsee. The forest pulsed with silence, waiting. His body shook violently, and still the voice came. Softer now, more intimate, as if whispering into the marrow of his bones. "Don't leave us, Kenji." His lips parted in a trembling gasp. They knew his name. They had always known. He staggered forward, clutching his chest, desperate to escape. But even as he fled deeper into the maze, the sensation remained, the unshakable certainty that whatever had spoken still followed, close enough to touch, waiting for the moment he could no longer run. Kenji staggered forward, his legs trembling beneath him, lungs burning as though the air itself resisted his every breath. The forest did not stretch in paths, it folded in on itself like a labyrinth alive, a twisting maze where logic held no meaning. Each trail mirrored the last, each tree a twin to the one before. The earth beneath his feet felt strangely soft, as if it had been walked upon by countless others who had vanished here. Swallowed whole, he tried to retrace his steps, searching for some mark of his passage, but the forest had already erased his presence. The footprints he thought he had left behind were gone, smothered by damp leaves, as though unseen hands had brushed them away. Panic gripped him tighter. He turned sharply, hoping to catch some landmark, anything recognizable, but all he saw was repetition, endless repetition, trees knitted so tightly together that they seemed to lean inward, conspiring to trap him. The silence deepened until it became unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something listening. Every rustle of his clothing, every gasp of breath, seemed magnified, thrown back at him like mockery, and beneath it all, the whispers still lurked, threading through the air, slithering just beyond comprehension. At times they rose like a chant, at others they dissolved into broken sobs. Their cadence was maddening, neither near nor far, neither male nor female, yet intimately close. Kenji gripped a tree for balance, his fingers clawing at the bark until splinters embedded in his skin. He whispered to himself, a desperate attempt to anchor his sanity. "It's just the forest, just trees, just silence." But his voice sounded wrong, too hollow, as if the forest had already claimed its echo. He called out louder, shouting his own name, but the sound seemed to vanish instantly, absorbed into the suffocating canopy. There was no return, no echo, no affirmation that he even existed here. A sudden noise froze him, footsteps soft, deliberate, pacing just beyond his vision. His heart pounded violently. He spun around, eyes wide, scanning the tangle of trees. The forest mocked him with stillness, but he knew he had heard it. He wasn't alone. Desperation clawed at his chest. He pulled his phone from his pocket, praying for even the faintest signal. The screen remained dark, mocking him with lifeless emptiness. The battery was fine, but the world beyond this forest no longer existed. His hand shook so violently he nearly dropped it. He shoved it back into his pocket, his breath unraveling into shallow sobs. The whispers swelled again, rising with cruel urgency. They no longer hid, they overlapped, layered, a chorus that spun around him like a tightening noose. Some called his name in tender tones, others hissed in broken guttural snarls. The effect was suffocating, pulling him in all directions, making him stumble deeper without choice. His legs felt less like his own, and more like they were being guided, tugged by invisible threads that tightened each time he resisted. Kenji realized then, with suffocating clarity, the forest wasn't lost. It wasn't confusing by accident. It was a design, a living maze that rearranged itself to ensure no one escaped, a trap woven of grief and shadow. And he, like so many before him, had already stepped too far inside. Kenji's frantic steps slowed to a crawl as the forest around him grew impossibly still, as if the very air had stopped moving. The whispers that had hounded him since his arrival suddenly fell silent, replaced by a suffocating quiet so heavy it pressed against his chest like stone. For the first time since entering Aokigahara, he wished the voices would return anything but this unnatural void. The silence was worse, more sinister, because silence was never truly empty. It was waiting. That was when he saw it. Between the trees, perhaps 20 paces ahead, a figure stood motionless. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, some grotesque shape formed by branches and fog, but the longer he stared, the more undeniable it became. The figure was pale, almost luminous against the gloom, its outline blurred as though it existed half in this world and half in another. Its body swayed unnaturally, as if suspended by strings. Kenji's throat tightened, his feet rooted to the earth, refusing to obey his desperate urge to flee. The figure's head tilted slowly to one side, a motion too smooth, too deliberate, accompanied by a faint crackling sound like splintering wood. Even in the distance, Kenji could see that its face was wrong. Where eyes and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin and empty mask that radiated something far worse than any expression could convey. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, drawing his attention only to that faceless thing. For a long, unbearable moment, neither moved. Kenji's breaths came shallow and uneven, each one ragged enough to cut his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained shackled, as if the figure's gaze, though it had no eyes, was holding him in place. Then, with agonizing slowness, the figure lifted one arm. Its movements were jerky, like bones grinding against each other, yet deliberate, undeniable. The arm extended outward, fingerless hand raising until it pointed not at Kenji, but deeper into the forest. The gesture was commanding, almost accusatory, as though it demanded obedience. Kenji shook his head violently, whispering to himself in disbelief, "No, no, no, I'm not going further." But the figure's stance remained unbroken. The silence pressed harder, heavier, until he felt his knees buckle. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, not as faint murmurs, but as a roar inside his skull. Voices screamed and wept, some chanting his name, others crying out words he couldn't understand. The cacophony was unbearable, clawing at his sanity. He clutched his ears, but the noise only grew, emanating from within his own mind. When he looked again, the figure was closer. The distance had shrunk without movement, as though space itself had collapsed. Its faceless head tilted again, cracking unnaturally, and the pointing arm shifted, insistent, unyielding. Kenji staggered back, horror flooding his veins. But with every step he took away, the forest seemed to bend, twisting the path so that he still faced the same direction. It was no longer a choice. The encounter was a command, and with each second he resisted, the figure seemed to loom larger, its presence sinking into him like hooks tearing flesh. Terrified beyond reason, Kenji felt his body betray him. His legs, trembling violently, began to move not away, but toward the direction the figure demanded. Each step dragged him deeper into the forest's heart, and though every fiber of his being screamed against it, he could not stop. Behind him, the silence collapsed into the faint sound of dragging feet, as though something unseen followed close, ensuring he obeyed. The encounter was not a warning, it was an initiation, and Kenji, powerless and shaking, was being led into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. Kenji's feet betrayed him, though his mind screamed to resist. His body moved as if tethered by invisible strings, dragged forward into the direction the faceless figure had commanded. His legs trembled violently with each step, yet they carried him deeper into the forest's suffocating heart. It was as if his will had been stolen, replaced by some other presence that had decided his fate long before he entered this place. The trees thickened around him, their branches curling together like skeletal arms, blotting out what little light remained. The air grew colder, dense with an oppressive humidity that clung to his skin like a shroud. He felt as though he were descending, though the ground beneath him was flat, its step pulling him lower, deeper, into a place that did not exist on any map. His heartbeat hammered painfully in his chest, but the rhythm no longer felt like his own. It was slower, heavier, like the pulse of something vast and unseen resonating through him as he stumbled onward. He began to notice the signs of others who had walked this path before him. Ropes dangled from branches, some new and taut, others frayed and rotting. They swayed slightly, though the forest remained eerily still. Shoes, backpacks, and scraps of fabric lay half-buried beneath moss, relics of those who had entered and never returned. Each object radiated despair like a residue, and with every new discovery, the whispers grew louder, more triumphant, as if celebrating his progress toward the inevitable. Kenji tried to stop, planting his feet firmly against the damp soil, but the force pulling him forward was relentless. His body shook violently, veins burning as if something within him resisted the forest's grip. But it was no use. The air vibrated with low, mournful tones. Not quite sound but not silence, either a vibration that rattled his bones and clouded his thoughts. He felt dizzy, detached from his own body, as though he were watching himself from far away, a puppet with strings buried in the dark earth. He passed beneath another rope, and this time he dared to look up. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw the faint shimmer of a body swaying, its head lolling unnaturally to one side. But when he blinked, the vision was gone, leaving only the rope twisting in emptiness. His stomach lurched violently, bile burning his throat. He knew then with agonizing clarity that he was walking through a graveyard not of bodies, but of souls, each one waiting, reaching, pulling at him to join them. The path narrowed until it felt like a tunnel of wood and shadow, the trees bending inward so tightly that he had to hunch to pass. The whispers pressed closer, no longer around him but inside him, clawing at his thoughts, erasing the line between his own voice and theirs. "Come deeper, don't fight, you belong to us." The words slithered like oil across his mind, coating every thought until resistance felt impossible. Kenji's tears blurred his vision. He gasped broken prayers, pleading to no one, to anyone, but his words fell lifeless into the damp air. His steps grew slower, not because he resisted, but because the weight pressing down on him grew unbearable. Each movement like wading through thick water. The forest no longer felt like a place, it felt like a mouth, and he was already halfway down its throat. With every step, Kenji realized he was no longer simply lost. He was being consumed, dragged into a realm that was not meant for the living. And somewhere in the shadows, unseen but certain, something was waiting to welcome him home. Kenji collapsed to his knees, his body trembling violently as though every ounce of strength had been siphoned out of him. The ground beneath his hands was damp and cold, slick with moss that pulsed faintly, as though alive. He could no longer tell how long he had been walking. The forest had devoured time just as it had devoured direction. His breath came in shallow, broken gasps, the sound trembling against the oppressive weight that pressed down on his chest. The whispers had grown unbearable, no longer scattered murmurs but a deafening chorus that roared inside his skull. They surged like crashing waves, flooding every corner of his mind until his own thoughts drowned beneath them. The voices were countless, weaving together into a single, terrible unity. Some cried in despair, others screamed in rage, and a few spoke in chilling tenderness, as though coaxing him to surrender. "You are ours. You belong here. Stay forever." And then the figure appeared again. It loomed directly before him now, no longer distant or hidden among the trees. Its faceless head hovered above him, tilted at an unnatural angle, smooth and pale as bone. Its presence radiated a suffocating cold that seeped into Kenji's skin, freezing the tears on his cheeks. He tried to look away, but his neck refused to obey. His eyes locked helplessly onto that blank visage, and for the first time he understood that emptiness could be more terrifying than any expression. The whispers converged, collapsing into a single voice, low, resonant, and inescapable. It wasn't a sound carried through the air. It was a vibration that sank into his bones, rattling his ribs, threading itself through the very core of his being. The voice spoke not beside him, not around him, but within him. "Now, you are one of us." Kenji's chest tightened as though invisible hands were pressing down, crushing his lungs. He clawed desperately at the ground, nails tearing against the soil, but the pressure only grew. His heart thundered wildly, then slowed, dragged down by an alien rhythm. His body shook with convulsions as the forest's breath mingled with his own, as if it was stealing the life from him. Thread by thread, dot in the shadows around him, shapes began to form, figures barely visible, swaying just beyond sight. Some crouched low, their limbs twisted at impossible angles, while others floated slightly above the ground, their faces blurred and indistinct. They circled him in silence, watching, waiting. Kenji's vision blurred as the edges of the world dissolved, yet their outlines burned into his mind like scars. These were the remnants, the souls swallowed by Aokigahara, and they had come to welcome him. His scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, but it was devoured instantly by the forest. Not even an echo remained. The faceless figure reached out then, its elongated arms stretching until the tips of its fingerless hand pressed against his chest. The moment it touched him, an icy surge shot through his body, and the whispers erupted in triumphant unison. Kenji felt his mind shatter like glass, splintering into fragments that no longer belonged to him. His memories, his fears, his very sense of self dissolved, absorbed into the endless chorus of the damned. His body slumped to the ground, lifeless, eyes wide and vacant. But his soul, his essence was gone, pulled into the abyss of voices that would haunt the forest forever. Among them, one rose freshly, weak at first, but growing stronger, blending seamlessly with the others. It was his own voice, calling out endlessly into the void. "Don't leave me. Stay with me, forever." Kenji was no longer a visitor in Aokigahara. He was part of it. Another whisper among thousands, bound eternally to the forest's hunger. Days later, hikers stumbled upon a lonely clearing deep within Aokigahara. There was no body, no sign of struggle, only a backpack resting at the base of a gnarled tree, its straps damp with dew. Inside, they found a half-empty water bottle, a notebook with pages blank from moisture, and a single photograph warped from the damp. The owner was nowhere to be seen. They left quickly, unwilling to linger, yet each swore that as they turned to go, they heard faint whispers following them, voices too low to be wind. Search parties would later comb that same stretch of forest. They carried bright ribbons to mark their trails, radios buzzing with static. Yet many reported feeling watched the moment they crossed into the deeper paths. Dogs trained to track scents whimpered and refused to move forward, their bodies trembling at something their handlers could not see. And though the search lasted days, not a single trace of Kenji was ever found. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. But those who dared to venture far into the sea of trees whispered of strange encounters. Some said they saw a pale figure standing among the trunks, swaying as if suspended by unseen strings. Others described hearing a man's voice calling faintly through the undergrowth, his tone fractured, desperate, begging for anyone not to leave him behind. A few hikers claimed they recognized their own names, carried in those phantom whispers, spoken in tones that were soft, intimate, and horribly familiar. The forest, however, remained indifferent. It neither explained nor revealed its secrets. To the outside world, Kenji's disappearance became another statistic, a number added to the hundreds of souls who had vanished in Aokigahara. But within the labyrinth of twisted roots and endless shadows, his presence endured. His voice had joined the eternal chorus, weaving seamlessly into the cacophony of sorrow that lingered in the trees. At night, when the wind slid across Mount Fuji and brushed the edge of the forest, some locals claimed they could hear faint murmurs carried with it like 1,000 broken prayers stitched together. They warned outsiders never to follow those voices, for they did not belong to the living. They belonged to the forest, to its hunger, to its whispers. And so Aokigahara endured, timeless and unyielding. It did not need to chase its prey. It only waited, patient and silent, for the broken and the lost to find their way to its heart. And when they did, it welcomed them, as it always had. Another shadow beneath the canopy, another voice among the whispers, another soul to wander its depths forever. The forest remained, a graveyard without gravestones, a sanctuary for despair. And if one stood long enough at its edge, listening closely, perhaps they would hear Kenji's voice among the countless others, still calling, still pleading, still trapped in the phantom whispers of Japan's most haunted place.